Hello everyone, today we talk about bloodshed and penitence in early medieval Europe, concentrating specifically on the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, right? I think actually made an identical video almost 2 years ago that is actually not bad, but today we maybe add a pinch more to it, it's a topic that we will have to come back on anyway. And it's a very fascinating one indeed, as it touches actually many aspects of early medieval culture, from Christian religion, political theory, social reality, military practice. So it's really one of those topics in which there is an enormous literature about, and that justifies the repetition, if anything. And today we talk specifically about what we can read in this period through the regulation, naturally, of penitence relatively to bloodshed, period about which, in fact, we don't know much about the rest, and especially about the military practice, and how this impacted, even just legally, the societies. Actually, we know fairly enough from the various ethnic laws of the various Romano-Germanic kingdoms. And in fact, the Anglo-Saxon and Frankish realities here provide interesting examples. But naturally, we have to learn always when we address these topics to distinguish the ideal and obviously the reality, but not reality as something we actually can know more than much about. Right? The ideal here is written by mostly religious sources, sometimes also by public authorities in terms of legal. You read legal codes not properly thinking that that's what is discipline is how things happened, like, right, but rather as a political tool to try to regulate society for things that evidently, if they needed to be disciplined in a time in which the state was a fairly primitive thing and didn't interfere more than much with levels of the communities, is eventually because these regulations were infringed in a way, right? There is an enormous problem. Think about ritual judicial dueling, right? That is something that went on for a very long time in many countries in Europe, from the north to the south. Here there wasn't much of a difference after all. It wasn't much of a cultural thing, properly, the level of development of the various societies, and a practical reality that we know was extremely violent, right? And that had its own logics in this regard. Obviously, the ecclesiastical sources have actually a positive approach to this. We maybe didn't address excessively the issue in other videos, but we have observed how Christianization went in parallel to the establishment of a more centralized order that brought pacification. The idea that you could go out there without being thrown an axe in your head from a moment to another. And that was really a big thing. The church brought an enormous material accomplishment in this regard through its own same ideology, but supporting actively those polities that were trying, in fact, to control, to regulate more societies and making them grow. Generally speaking, the most regulated societies in this context were actually the most prosperous, right? The less regulated societies, the one that give us the example, the impression, apparently, if you just read them superficially, that everybody was free, right? Because after all, there was a few regulation, it was simpler, right? So that society had to be freer, hence happier. Actually, it's the other way around. Those societies basically went on their own way. There was this minimal generalized idea of what justice was fundamentally about, and it didn't work quite well in terms of civil development, of centralization of political and military development and accomplishments, right? So looking at Anglo-Saxon England had a very gradual but at the same time very consistent improvement under this regard, right? Today we arrive fundamentally at Hastings, and we observe how by that time, naturally, the Anglo-Saxon administrative structures were some of the most advanced in Europe. Like, the Anglo-Saxon juridical system also was pretty advanced. Of course, also that society was messed up, was somewhat in crisis in some ways. Up to that point, has the same Hastings can say proofs in absolute terms, but definitely there was something in there that had changed a freaking lot, especially in the last 2 centuries. But we will leave that for other Anglo-Saxon history videos. Frankish society was, in a way, in spite of its higher degree of privatization, private rule was much larger, simply because society was more dramatically stratified, and it's from that same private background that, after all, a proper order emerged, as feudalism fundamentally came to develop. So it's a different reality that also undergoes very interesting changes from Merovingian to Carolingian to later, when the empire was split, but, whatever you want to talk about, Ottonian, Capetian times. It grew differently, of course, in the various areas of post-Carolingian Europe, but substantially towards a construction of at least stable local lordships. But this is yet another concept that we have already discussed, and we will have to discuss once again. But the problem of bloodshed was an important one, right? When we talk about this extremely violent societies, we don't have to think that, since violence was so regular, was so normal in many ways, the reasons for which it was enacted were trivial, right? Of course, human life costed less. At the time, human life had a much lesser cost than today's ones. And as a consequence, there were, think about, even people were segmented in base of juridical freedom. I mean, there were freemen, there were serfs, even based, a female slave was much cheaper than a male slave, for example. So there were dramatic socio-economical differences, juridical differences, and that reflected a background of this society, especially towards the north, that really hadn't much meant before Christianization, much of a different ethos than the one of saying, if I come sword in hand here and I want to, and I kill you, right? The fact that I've killed you gives me the right to rule in your place, right? That was the basic ethos, and let me tell you, it's really not, a very effective recipe for a healthy society. So much that, in fact, the northern you go, the simpler, the more tribal the societies were, and naturally such behaviors were also, to be contextualized as effective with the lack of any other authority, right? But what is fascinating, naturally, in this time is that it's from those bases whichever they were, that the thing gets slightly better, and the local police, independently of their previous background, start pacifying, right? And this goes naturally in parallel with the construction of monarchies, in parallel with Christianization. And ideology was trying to regulate something that cannot be excluded from, not just from politics or society, but properly from human nature. Violence is a part of how humans exist in the first place, biologically, evolutionarily speaking, and it's not something you can. It has nothing to do with culture in terms of the primordial motives that create enmity and conflict, right? Culture just shows us how this is declined in various realities, but the essence is universal, is in common, it's absolute in many ways. You can't do without that. So we already made some videos about the creation of for example, a Roman Christian conscience that fundamentally saw the Catholic Church legitimizing violence in the name of the safety of the state, essentially. And developing the theory of just war with St. Augustine, and we will quote also today, and Ambrose of Milan, etc. When I talk about Catholic before the 11th century, of course, I'm talking about properly the Catholic Church, that is, the universal, unique church that existed at the time, because that's katholon in Greek, but the universal church. Then eventually the split between what we call today as Catholic and Orthodox is another thing, but that had a background in common. As you know, in fact, we mentioned St. Augustine. Here we also mentioned St. Basil for the Byzantine world, let's call it in this way, naturally these two areas of Europe have had different sensitivities from a spiritual, from a cultural point of view, and they followed different paths, right, that were, still had a track in common after all, a main track in common, but that also, and especially and essentially, as the Clausewitz in Trinity teaches, for political and social reasons, were also differing in the way violence was exercised. So the concept of penitence and of atonement is always connected in Christianity, right? It implied this rigorous atonement, as a matter of fact, that had to be objectivized in some way, right? It obviously had to be something inner, in the soul, with the contrition, with the penitence, and so on. But it had to be, properly certified in a tangible way, in a public way. Killing a person is a sin, and there is no way out of that, right? The idea of shedding blood in every circumstance, right? This is more even than just killing. It has to do with properly the original, Judaic idea of, the impurity of blood itself, right? It's a deep thing, right? It's obviously connected to, of course, to the value of human life, etc., but not all, right? It's something that it was connected in general with other aspects, even tribal societies in Europe that had developed in this kind of materialistic but mystical and material sense alike, right? As most people lived at the time, fundamentally. And shedding blood was a form of impurity from which you had to be washed. And the usage of inflicting an official punishment for every homicide warrior is to be found up to the 11th century, right? Early Christianity took always very seriously the necessity of inflicting a punishment to whoever shed blood, no matter how good the reason was, how motivated it was. It's something that goes beyond. It's always a sin, right? The same goes in the Byzantine world, right? It's not that Christianity brought to any end to bloodshed or violence from paganism onwards in this regard. If anything, we have seen that, historically speaking, the greater the civilization, the greater is the potential for destruction and destructiveness proper of the same, of the military instruments. So it's not that these people were more like, well, in relative, it depends, right? Because it's obviously that the pagan tribal world was a constant bloodshed as a raison d'être, right? Killing other people was normal in the sense that, it was either you or the other, right? Because if you wanted to survive, one or another, there was no enough resources. This thing gets on a larger scale, to use always a Clausewitzian language, when states grow, right? Think about the Carolingian Empire. But really, what Western and Eastern Christendom, if we want to define them already in this way, in their different sensitivities and practice and rituals, is that killing is always a sin, and it must be atoned in a way or another. So for the Eastern Christendom, Basil the Great, 330-379, is the major point of reference, right, as St. Augustine for the West. And Basil recommended that he who had shed blood in a war had to be deprived of the communion for 3 years, right? This is not properly an excommunication. This is an incommunication, right? The idea that you cannot receive the communion. You can't properly be close to the other faithful, right? And for the reason you are sinful and impure. The Archbishop Theodore of Canterbury, 668-690, one of the most important spiritual figures of the Anglo-Saxon world, originary of the broader Mediterranean, even cultural sensitivity, but he introduced a lot of this aspect also in Anglo-Saxon society, demonstrated to be, however, less rigorous already in his letter to the priest Eud, right? Because he stated, he who, by order of his lord, has killed a man in a public war has to be penitent to make penitence for 40 days. Right. So here we see something that, honestly, I'm not an expert on Theodore of Canterbury's work, but the impression I get immediately is that also Theodore might have adapted to the reality of the Anglo-Saxon world. Right. The Anglo-Saxon world in the 7th century, at the end of the 7th century AD, is not the Byzantine world at the end of the 4th century AD. They are very different realities. Right, one is essentially a tribal, or slightly something, these smaller kingdoms are essentially emerging from a tribal background, private seigneuries most of the times, but it's something more consistent, especially in the south of England, to essentially a central state, can say centralized, but properly, a monarchy that controls a statal apparatus and has a permanent army, as a great regional extension. It's fundamentally a universal empire, by the way. So we get, in many ways, the impression that the Byzantines, namely, took more seriously the problem of punishment. The idea, this Saint Basil has said, if you kill someone, you had to be excluded from the communion for 3 years, right? Deprived of the communion for 3 years. So that's a long time, right? Especially for a soldier that actually kills way more than one person in 3 years on a regular basis, and yet it really shows a character of the Byzantine perpetua sanctio, this idea that after all the empire had to embody hardly the essence of the Christian perfection, that you couldn't be less of what a father of the church, that was, by the way, so closely connected, especially for that cultural circuit, had said, right? And this is very interesting because there are studies from exactly the 7th century, the age of Theodore of Canterbury, of Byzantine military ethics. That is to say, one thing is what the Patriarch of Constantinople says, what is something said in the councils, another, even in the local churches. Another thing is what happens within the armies, in the various units, in how the soldier thinks of himself. And these studies show the most Christian, in the universal Christian empire, that Byzantine soldiers basically had not even the slightest interest in embracing a Christian military culture, would be obliged, as all intelligent people, to pragmatically adapt to reality. That is to say, okay, these Anglo-Saxons basically, they don't have, they're nominally Christian themselves, but evidently their customs are very far, on average, from what the Christian morals preach. So let's still make him understand that killing is a real deal, right? It's something that really goes beyond it. There can be no compromise about. But taking away their communion for 3 years to these people, it's impossible. It doesn't make sense, right? They would take it as an outrage. They wouldn't understand the intrinsic problem of it, because what would an Anglo-Saxon warrior would be really proud of killing an enemy, right? And it's not that they wouldn't feel the distress, the horror, the horrifying aspects of violence, that they wouldn't be shaken, they wouldn't be traumatized, right? Post-traumatic stress disorders are something we can trace very, very back in in time, and so there was still in a society, however, that praised warriorhood and violence, etc. The need to say, you have killed a person, it's a bad thing, but take this penitence for 40 days, right, and then come back renewed, right, to society, to the communion, right, to this world that, of course, the Anglo-Saxon, but I don't imagine what Northumbria could be in the 7th century AD, at the end of the 7th century AD, right? It's a pagan war, easily, hands down. But the point is that still the church has a meaning here that starts going beyond an arbitrary imposition, but it starts embodying an overlordship, essentially, that is often paired to the one of the local lords themselves, the secular lords that in fact use the church extensively. They have private foundations there, and that therefore derive their legitimization also through the adherence to the Christian moral preachings. So an Anglo-Saxon penitential of the same age expresses itself in similar terms. It says, if the king leads... by the way, we haven't commented on the content of, an important detail of Theodore's letter. That is, if a man has killed another one in a public war, right? This idea of the public war doesn't really mean that in the practice, like if it wasn't a public... What's a public war? First of all, the idea is that public war is something that the higher authorities of society have decided theoretically for the community. And here there is in fact a very interesting transition from the warrior freedom, the nightmarish reality where everybody, raids and slaughters and, fights on a regular basis, and then a bit of, organization based on a lord, even on a king, self-styled this way most of the times, that would try to make order and to bring control over the local resources, developing trade and so on. This is not it's an oppressive, transition in some ways, but it's also one that brings substantial improvements in these societies. So public war in this regard is the one that essentially the king, I imagine, calls for. Right, the idea of a war is not just public, but is essentially it has to be Christian in many ways and just according to other standards. But that in this context, evidently in Anglo-Saxon England couldn't be much more dissociated from what appeared as mostly riotous as in fact a collective, like a public decision going to war. That not existing another overlord over the wall, over these kingdoms, the seigneuries, seem to be the only legitimate medium with the divine. Because let's remember that this idea of legitimizing your action, as we were saying before, through religion, is exactly the same in paganism as it is in Christianity. Right, the difference stands mostly in what the individual conscience has to say about that and about a universal egalitarian principle that stems with the value of life, of everybody's life as sacred. It was something very different for what the pagans didn't know, essentially. Right, the idea of if you were a slave, you were essentially not a human being, or at least you were not as the others, because you had been curbed. You had lost your rights, right? In the moment in which you decided instead, to keep on fighting, to be captured, right? It's a brutal background. But the medium is the same, right? The pagan believes that he wins not because he's cool for a specific reason, but because the divine has entered him and has allowed him to win on the battlefield. This is the standard idea, that there was no such thing like a, non-religious as religion as something that fundamentally lived outside. It was a proper hierarchy of the divine, even in the pagan world, right? It wasn't just a world with many differently equal gods, right? There was a precise hierarchy that went towards the sublimation of the absolute, that was connected specifically with war, right? So that's why this public war here, even for a newly Christianized Anglo-Saxon, would appear, after all, as a riotous one, right? And the lack of further distinction here in the letter of Theodore may be a hint of that. So as we're saying, there is this other penitential, more or less the same age. It says, if the king leads an army within the kingdom against rebels, essentially, someone who has risen or rebelled, and makes war fighting for the kingdom or for the ecclesiastical justice, whoever commits a homicide in such circumstances will not have committed a serious crime. However, because of the bloodshed proper, he shall not frequent the church for 40 days and has also to practice fasting for some weeks and ask to be welcomed by the bishop with humility, and if he will be reconciled, he will eventually receive the communion after 40 days. Right? It goes on and says, if an invader of pagans occupies the land, devastates the churches, and wages war, and actually, brings pushes to war the Christian people, whoever kills an enemy does not commit a serious crime, but he shall not frequent the church for 7, 14, or 40 days, and then, purified, he shall have access to the church. So here it's more complex, and it's a further distinction. Because fundamentally, rebellion in the Christian world is really not a very positive thing. The Christian world is generally allied, if anything, not just because of the reality of this context, but probably since the Judaic the tradition to the established order, generally speaking. I mean, that is something, for example, Islam doesn't have. Islam is always suspicious towards any earthly government. In Christianity, instead, there is the idea that you should not passively obey everything that your government says, but generally speaking, you should mind about the fact that that's the government that God has chosen to be in there, right? So even here, there is a bit that previous justification of saying, if you are able, for example, to overthrow the government, then eventually it's also because God eventually wanted it. This doesn't even have to do with whether the government is righteous or not, right? God may want maybe you to suffer under a negative, even an impious or even a non-Christian government, right? I don't know, look at the Jews under and fleeing from Egypt, for example. So there's a pretty, paradigmatic reality that a Jew or a Christian would have in mind in that regard. But here, the thing, and it's purely speculative, frankly, in the first example, it may be, after all, that rebels, right, were seen in this Anglo-Saxon context as maybe not this terrible disruptors, the destroyers of the social order, but generally speaking, like free people that, after all, weren't I repeat it, in the end of the 7th century, so it's a very early date. There is still this ethos of egalitarianism, after all. It means that actually is valid just for the oligarchies, as always, not for the everyday guy out there, right? The egalitarian character of northern society is exclusively aristocratic. Don't ever think it's actually about the people, right? That's already at this time a very hypocritical way of putting that. But still, evidently has it's a more serious thing. Like, here it says specifically the king, right? So the monarchy is namely already established, right? We know how much, Anglo-Saxon England, this monarchy is, there are larger but also very small monarchies that, these guys call them reges, but they're technically just like local lords, and not much more than that. But it says, it's not a big deal. If the king has ordered you to kill, you go to war to kill on behalf of the king. It's not such a serious problem, but you will have, however, to not to frequent the church for 40 days. If you have shed blood, that's the discriminant. You will have to fast as well, and eventually there is this interesting medium that is the bishop. Right, you have to be humble towards the bishop. That will here. It's kind of implicit that he's the one that actually has to determine whether you can come back within the Christian community in this sense, so that after 40 days you may receive communion again. But this already tells you how more subtle in many ways this reality is. Even if the bishop has some power in the society, and at the same time there is a deeper criticism of your actual atonement. Like it's there is something symbolic, physical, that you have to suffer, right? Even fasting, right, being excluded from the rest of the community. But or at least the Christian, the church specifically. The church here, I don't know what it's meant. That he could not tend church specifically, or that he just couldn't. He wasn't seen as well around. But it's all very vague. It doesn't even probably matter in practice. But the point is, the bishop has this arbitrum, right? Has this idea of saying, let's. It's not such an enormous crime to have killed a person if we're serving the king in war, but we still have to be sure that you don't bring in the evil, that you really repent for this, and that you understand that this is a serious thing, that in front of the community you have to be purified from the sin that you have committed. And the contrast here exists with naturally and these are rebels. This is the thing that is interesting about that in other circumstances, that as they will develop further, even in the rest of, for example, when feudal society will start developing, rebelling to a king is an act of treason. It's punishable by death by the foe, right? If you take by the 14th century, maybe, the attitude towards someone who rebels the king is even worse to one towards like an infidel, right? So that's a really important thing here. Instead, the rebel is seen like someone that should be crushed, but you have to do the full 40 days. That are not much. Everybody tells you it's not such a serious thing, but at the same time you have to do it. If instead here it says a pagan, right, an invasion of pagans occupies the land, so this is a way more disruptive, it's presented at least as a way more disruptive thing, devastates the churches, says it pushes toward the Christian people, right? And here this is not Viking era, right? So pagans did exist close enough, right? Within the same Anglo-Saxon world. And in this regard, it would be interesting to see how the various Anglo-Saxon communities discriminate against each other politically, right, for this very reason. And it says, if you kill in this situation an enemy, right, it doesn't even say if you're serving under a king. So it could be even as well, if you take your own arms and you fight against the pagan invader, then you will have to stay away from the church for it really depends. It could be 7, 14, or even the full 40 days. And even if here, maybe the source actually implies that it's still under a king's command, we don't know, but the thing that is implied here is that probably the role of the bishop had remained unvaried, right? There was someone to decide whether you had to be outside the community for the whole 40 days, regularly speaking, or just for 7. And this tells also a lot on, how, shaded the set of circumstances could be, right? This is not a pagan invader that is, at least your atonement is not connected directly to that, right? Because you could have sinned after all in ways that are maybe not even so different the ways those pagans do in that regard. But the circumstance, right, the whole circumstance, maybe it's fine, and someone has to however still evaluate how close to the to a fair bloodshed this thing went. There is the penitential bid, right, in which the soldier that kills during a war has to make 40 days of fast. The same penitence and the same period of time are contemplated in the Penitentiale Vallicellanum Primum, right, which is from the second half of the 8th century, as in the Penitentiale Vallicellanum Secundum, right, from the end of the 10th, right. Here we're already in the Viking era, as you understand, and Britain's being ravaged, and this the latter, the second Vallicellian penitentials specifies that the fasting has to consist in bread and water. Right, this is symbolical, but eventually not even so much, because what would you fast with? Just with, fish instead of meat or stuff like that. It depends. It has to be a serious thing. Here it concentrates chiefly on the regulatory, if you want, on the detail, right? And as we have seen, the penitence is still the same, but it just adds a small detail. And there is the Arundel penitential from the end of the 10th century that interestingly comes back to the 3 years of penitence that were and that had been contemplated by Saint Basil for, quote, he who, having his homeland invaded, kills an enemy. Right, so here naturally could easily be a Viking invasion, right? A disruptive thing, something that in previous Anglo-Saxon warfare hadn't been seen by scale, right? Especially after by the 9th century, the end of the 9th century, and this is important because it shows that bloodshed in this regard, in an England that has been messed up after all, that hasn't simply suffered these invasions, but is also starting to evolve towards a more complexly, collectively monarchic system, and from which there are chunks that even side with the Vikings and so on, and want to maintain an internal order that is probably being disrupted, right? Is probably seeing the rise of people that maybe even want to fight the Vikings, but are doing it on their own. They're gaining power on their own, and they're ruling on their own on a local base, right? The thing is becoming serious, and this penitential states 3 years of penitence, right? So the bloodshed in this regard is seen as something at least more problematic in the general political background of the situation. And it could be just a normal penitentiary. Maybe the practice was still, very, very different, as we just said we said at the beginning. But it's still meaningful that such a long time is thought to be reinstated, right? With an evident awareness of the, at least in this case, of Saint Basil, and therefore of a tradition that starts going beyond, right, what the local practices had been formed in the previous centuries specifically. Now, passing to the Frankish word broadly meant. Fulbert of Chartres, at the beginning of the 11th century, inflicts only 1 year of penitence. In the same period, Burkhard of Worms, in the Corrector Sive Medicus, has the penitent interrogated by his own confessor in terms that betray definitely an Augustinian influx. He says, "Have you killed in war on behalf by the order of a legitimate prince that was making war in order to re-establish peace? Right? Have you assassinated the tyrant that was, getting busy at troubling the peace? Right? If yes, you will fast for 3 Lents in the prescribed days. But if things have gone differently, outside of the orders of a legitimate prince, you will have to make penitence as for a voluntary homicide." Right. This is very interesting because it shows a reality that is definitely more advanced than the ones we've seen before, and that really goes deeper into the political and moral question of the story. It says, have you killed in war by order of a legitimate prince that was making war in order to reestablish peace, right? And the question is, who does judge that? Right, this is a pretty tricky question. First of all, is it a legitimate prince? And the question is, on what base exactly? Is it dynastic? Is it what the local communities have decided? Is it what the church decided? Here there are important splits, right? Even in the church, and this had been in the previous ones centuries of civil strife in Western Francia, for example. It had been a pretty serious moment, which even kings had been deposing one another, making war, dying on the field. So it's an enormous deal. You don't just judge so easily that. And also, what does it mean to make war in order to establish peace exactly? I mean, the concept is easy, that naturally there is a kind of a recognized political institutional establishment, and who is disrupting that and troubling to the whole society, and Christianity is infringing peace and definitely working bad in that regard. But what if in this case, how do you concretely judge this? How can you start serving science? First of all, and this is really the problem, how can you say no to a lord? 11th century Francia is properly a now a highly advanced society, where we have seen that lords are dramatically powerful, that they are truly powerful as kings, as a matter of fact, and by far more than other areas in Europe, surely more than in Anglo-Saxon England. And the question here is very tricky, right? Who is this guy? And how tied are you to him? Who are you especially? Who would actually be even put under this interrogation? Because this sounds more like a trial than a confession, right? And it's becoming effectively a serious thing in those patterns, because there was probably even a political institutional way to assert and to assess this legitimacy, in which the church naturally was involved. So we can expect that this wasn't like the average peasant, about whom, as always, nobody ever gave a damn, right? Even comprehensibly, but this is a question that weighs mostly on a lord, on someone that really serves the king closely, with retinues, with that has made an important choice, that has made the difference, as a matter of fact. And after all, the penitence, even in here, is is heavy is light in the case you have done the right thing, yay, but it's heavy in the case you haven't. As a matter of fact, it will be considered as a voluntary homicide if you haven't respected these rules. And that means you can even die, right? Usually, at this point you still could compensate, but usually at a very big amount of money just the nobility in fact had. The rest of the people were killed on a regular basis, or made slaves, or stuff like that. So it's actually very very important to stress this differences, because they tell you properly more than what the moral thing is. This tells you a lot about the local politics, about what really the Francia of the vassalitic beneficiary lordships had become by that time, right? I can't help but criticize polemically on the fact that every time you talk about religion on the internet, that the average no one starts immediately being either triggered in a sense or another, like yay religion, or bad religion is garbage, and they don't even contextualize religion in the history of humanity, right? And this is a very upsetting thing, because these people could do that. We in the 21st century we are losing that thing, right? There is a dogmatic, absolutistic moralism that reveals no conscience whatsoever. These people realized what conscience was, because all humans know that after all, when they're killing someone, that there is something serious about that, right? We can't imagine these societies as violent as they could be, as people like to kill each other. People really never like to kill each other. We're not biologically designed to do much more than shouting at a distance, punching at the chest, and throwing rocks at each other. Killing someone, just as among humans or in nature, is actually a pretty rare thing. So these things emerge, like this, the wars emerge, of course, from a civilized context where politics and society matter a freaking lot. And that's where Christianity is genial, because it really obliges you to take a stand from a moral point of view. It's not just following the trails, just saying, what did you do? Did you realize you had a responsibility to that? Well, that's civilization, right? And these are considerations that you never hear much around, and they're actually pretty elementary, at least if you have ever read anything about these topics from a real point of view, right? Not just because you have to criticize religion or thinking that it's that it's something untouchable, vice versa, because that's a ghost that you have in your mind, and what religion really wants is to ask yourself whether you have done the right thing, and that's a universal message, a universal language, right? And even if you're not religious, that still matters, and that's what fundamentally religion tries to to highlight in the first place. We should talk more actually about history of religion, but it's at least we chose more violent topics, as you understand, but they always intertwine. But in general, what can we draw from these penitentials? Well, first of all, that a distinction can and should or must be done between unjust wars, in which homicide is severely punished, and in basically defensive or anyway legitimate wars, in which the same homicides require just a light penitence, right? Now, I would like to stress this difference because it really makes you understand more about the moral reality of the situation, how you can start reasoning about morals, how much of what we created after the Treaty of Westphalen and eventually with human rights fundamentally stems from that. After all, there is a political social responsibility for the use of violence, right? Violence is not wrong per se, not even in its consequences, but specifically on why you are using that, right? And consequently how, and the consequences of it proper. What does this mean? That killing is good? No, because in all of these penitences, you have to, in fact, you have to make penitence for every kind of homicide you make, right? There is no single element who said, okay, you kill someone, okay, you can go. No, you're a sinner. You killed a person. You killed a human being. You killed someone that could be, that could repent from his sins themselves, that could do something about himself, right? But you killed, and the reason why you're justified, what this is accepted from a political and social point of view by the church, is that naturally other people can get killed, that the general disruption of society is the worst thing that can happen, right? And that should be prevented, and that preventing that trying to prevent that is what makes the difference, right? So unfortunately, as we were saying before, these are concepts that are still very far from being universally even understood today, right? Think about pacifism, that claims that every form of violence is negative. So it means that basically every resistance to tyranny and oppression, to totalitarianisms, to people who want to exterminate their own kind, shouldn't be done, right? So basically, you for a pacifist, you should take away from the face of the earth any form of resistance to oppression, right? Any form of of government as at the end of the day, because what kind of government is the one that doesn't use at least deterrence or sometimes openly violence in order to maintain order? By a minimum it must exist. And generally speaking, the political debate about in the social contract is not just whether violence can be exercised or not, but who can, right? That is a centralized state that monopolizes the control of violence, or maybe the citizens that can be armed with their own militias and so on, and there is a balance between the thing. But it's very important that at the the even nature of an homicide, that remains a sin universally for every person, for no one excluded, right? Even if it's king, he has to be to make atonement for having killed another human being. But what really the attention here is shifted towards, very very intelligently, very very civilly, and very pragmatically, is what was the reason for that? Were you defending yourself? Were you doing that for someone who wanted to disrupt the civil order? And naturally, around this, history happens. That is, everybody eventually judges for his own interest and so on. So this is not a way of solving the thing easily, because nobody has ever done it, never will, right? It's very hard to determine what goes on in the first place, and everybody is dramatically malleable from a mental point of view. Think about all the people who can be easily manipulated, politically speaking, in this world, right? It's so easy. Most people are like that. But evidently, and this is, by the way, another reason why these directions, these regulations are evidently directed at higher levels of the sources of these penitentials are probably upper clergy, right? We have seen Theatre of Canterbury, we have seen Schwerpunkt of Chartres. Others are actually anonymous penitentials, but generally speaking, this wasn't, we can imagine, like the parish of the most peripheral Frankish or Anglo-Saxon rural community, right? These were people that lived very close to kings and emperors, and how important for the political reality such distinctions were. And there is also another thing that you cannot twist, really, that is how peaceful a society is, right? The idea that, for example, a legitimate king is the one that can maintain order, because if he can't, he's unfit and can be deposed, was a recognized principle at the time. And the first, and I totally agree with this, even for today's times, the first duty of every government should be first and foremost to ensure public security, right? That's the essential. If there is no public security, nothing else works. This is what history has showed us quite elementarily, quite microscopically, and quite evidently throughout all its course, right? If society is not pacified, you can't do anything. Economy is blocked, people have reasons to kill each other to survive. It can't work. There can't be a cohesive reality. So, yeah, you can try to make your own your agenda, your propaganda, and so on. But the point is that if your kingdom is in turmoil and you can't put an end to that, well, quite likely things are not going to be good, nor for you, not for many other people that in fact may start taking matters in their own hands. And this is a very important discriminant, and naturally everybody has makes attempts to bring the situation from their own side, but there is probably a strife that is an objective reality and that cannot be obscured or masked. And a similar evaluation implies a lifestyle of war in which every warrior is generally controlled, right? Which people can say, whether he has committed an homicide or not. And if this excludes the position of St. Augustine, for whom are innocent, or those soldiers that serve in a war, even an unjust one, because they do not but obey to a prince. This depends perhaps not much from a deeper sense of individual responsibility, but rather in the changes that had intervened in the methods of recruitment of the armies, in which the notion of mandatory service is largely surpassed. This is also a very important aspect of the story, because indeed, did you understand this? This is really fundamental. St. Augustine said that you can even fight for a tyrant, but maybe it's not your fault, because in St. Augustine's time, after all, military service had been reinforced as mandatory. These great warlords of late Roman times simply hired whoever was in the provinces under their control, and St. Augustine, that is, I don't want to criticize him, but he's generally way more subtle than that. But he arrives to say that is particularly meaningful about the times he was leading. That after all, he was innocent because he was forced to do so. Well, this is something that actually Western civilization would have surpassed as a concept, and you would think it emerged as from who knows when, from a time of great statal advancement of civil right. No, it's stamped here from the early Middle Ages, from what people sometimes still obstinate to call the Dark Ages, right? This was the moment in which, after all, thanks not just to the Roman, but also the Germanic element here, was reintroduced the idea that after all, you, as an individual, matter. And not only that, but what you do matters, largely. And which means that you're largely, if not completely, responsible for your actions, because it doesn't even matter what you're doing that for, as we have seen. But if you kill a person, that's still an enormous deal, and you have to be punished for it. So this is a much deeper, like if you look at the Western, the Christian, religious culture and tradition, this is a major turning point, right? And it is true, because naturally the Romano-Germanic kingdoms were something much more, much less, coercive in power. The communities that fought largely were active protagonists of wars, right? And so the reality was definitely much more evenly oriented towards the individual actions, right? And this is also a moment in which the church starts spreading outside, for example, the cities. Like, it could be just that in Augustinian times, where the countryside was largely exclusively pagan. Sometimes. Excuse me, I drink a little. At this point in early medieval times, the church has spread a bit everywhere in the countryside, so lots of people are still pagan, or as it was normal at the time, they were both Christian and pagan, because that's also the reality of Europe for centuries and centuries to come. And that therefore the community started to care more about this new moral dimension that, after all, controlled individuals from a much lower step of the political and social ladder. And the fact that a part of public opinion found unjustified every penitence, doesn't matter how light it was, for an homicide was committed during the course of a just war, can be demonstrated also by a letter written by Rabban Maurus just after the 841 Battle of Fontenoy, that was basically the greatest Carolingian bloodshed ever. It was what eventually would bring to the definitive split of the empire in those three major chunks of Western Francia, Eastern Francia, and Italy. And it was a major event at the time. It's actually a dramatically under-documented battle. Actually, the only tactically documented battle in Carolingian military history is the Battle of Zunta, that we also talked about in the video on the Carolingian conquest of Saxony. And this battle was like very impressive at the time, because literally we know a few, but the numbers here were quite big, and it was literally a bath of blood, right? They killed each other in a way. The Carolingians is often just like the Romans. Like, do you think how big empires fall because there are barbarians invading them? It's obviously because they're fighting within each other internally. That's how it happened for the Carolingians as well, that were sending Vikings one against the other, just to make an example. And also to stress, because you probably understood that I like the Carolingians at this point, and I want always to stress the fact that naturally continental European history, compared to the Viking invader, was actually a way more and a dramatically more advanced, developed, and complex system to study, a way more interesting one to study, as a matter of fact, and dramatically underestimated one in popular culture, because simply popular culture doesn't give a damn about any important thing whatsoever. But it's from this humus that properly even certain ideas rose, right? And Rabban Maurus eventually inserted his thought in another penitential, which was in turn inserted in the Synodalibus Causis et Disciplinis Ecclesiasticis by Regina of Prüm, and in the Decretum of Burkhard of Worms, that states something like this: that is, some excuse the recently perpetrated homicides in the rebellion and war of our princes, and they do not for this deem to make penitence, since this war has been done by orders of the princes and has to be underposed to the judgment of God, right? But it's important, it's necessary that who desires to defend this terrible massacres shall consider if they can be excused in front of the eyes of God as innocents, those that have depreciated the eternal God because of cupidity, that is source of all evil, and because of the protection of their secular lords, that depreciating God's orders, have committed homicide, not by chance but deliberately, right? So this is a beautiful statement that shows how naturally at the time, like in every age, there is always someone who says, yeah, okay, but I'll do it anyway, because they had something to gain from. Here, the Rabban Maurus is evidently, astonished by the lack of morality in a context in which, the Carolingian Empire was literally falling apart, and these wars were fought for the most diverse interests. That this was a war that engulfed the whole empire, so everyone from every place had their own reason for doing it, and naturally most of them presumably were doing it for their own personal gain, and many of them said, this is actually not a war we have to repent for, even for killing people, because we were doing it for by order of our princes. Were fighting in their retinues. This was a very advanced military system by this point, and we're fighting Franks against Franks. So there were the finest armies out there in the first place. And this is a game that fundamentally has to do with the reasons that have always brought us to serve in the retinue of a king, and so on. And naturally, this was a very kind of creepy way of seeing that, because naturally the empire was collapsing exactly because of the increasing disconnection between the monarchs and the various local clienteles, and that could be fueled naturally channeled into monarchical action for shared interests of the various chunks of the empire that were forming right now, but that were naturally interested. And some of the greatest atrocities in here were committed, as in any war, And therefore, Robin is astonished by the fact that these people do not even realize that this is a war in which you're sinning as in any other, if not even worse in them. And the reason of this is cupidity. People want to essentially loot the enemy territories, making money, becoming more powerful, and that's what the world system has, after all, been about, right? Consider that the Frankish reality is the farthest in absolute terms, at least for Western European standards, aside from, well, let's say it's very far from others, especially in the south, from any idea of public authority. Right? The Carolingian Empire has been, by definition, like since Merovingian legacy, a private power. Right? The kings have always believed, the emperors have always believed, maybe with the exception of some enlightened ones like Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, that you can't make a system being ruled exclusively by privates. There must be an order, there must be a state, there must be an authority that keeps control of all what is going on. But these Frankish warriors wouldn't give a damn about that. They thought, just like in the ancient pagan fashion, that whatever they conquered was their own. And therefore, who cares about whoever gets in the middle? We'll see how actually in the same Carolingian military culture, and that was mostly a work of the elites that were, not surprisingly, dramatically influenced by the ecclesiastical legacy that now was consolidating. At least the only thing that was working in the Carolingian Empire was the church, at least in relative terms, and that's what probably would save even European culture at many levels during the following centuries, because the church was naturally instead a much more statal and central like entity, community by its own, right? Even if it wasn't directly controlled by but by same constitution. If anything, they didn't split their possessions among the various sons generation after generation, as the Franks instead did on a regular base, which was another major factor for the disintegration of their empire, because each one wanted their own thing, right? The community does not exist, I just exist. And this is the typical warrior mentality, right? The caste mentality. I've already expressed my deep contempt for the revisitation of the concept of warrior for our citizen soldiers that are, it took thousands of years of civilization to pass from warriors to citizen soldiers. We should be proud as hell for that, and there are people out there that even think that the warrior thing is a real is a real thing in the first place, that still what we do today, we do it because of the warriors, right? Not because of civilization that has disintegrated the warrior under the weight of real arms manned with intelligence, and just secondly with force and with synergic employment of means, not just with the singular guy that goes out there to show off, right? That's what tribal societies did, and look at where tribal societies are now, right? That are under our feet. And this is a great lesson. I don't plainly say that history is a place where you can pick lessons from in a moralistic absolutistic sense. But look at this. If you're really fascinated with those very unsympathetic cultural revisitations that can spread just in times like today's, where people do not even read about history, study about history anymore in the first place, what they brought to. And look at what the church was doing instead. That was realizing that was not a good thing. Guess what happened? The Carolingian Empire evaporated. The church did not. Right, the ecclesiastical lordship strengthened solidly in the ensuing times, and they managed to build a connected tissue, right, in early medieval Europe that connected also in terms of ideas, of knowledge, of capacity, of understanding, to rebuild after this mess, together with the secular authorities. But secular authorities now had to restart from scratch because the empire, the Carolingian Empire, had gravitated on a privatistic base that didn't have no room for structural improvement of permanent structures, of statal structures, of something that could regulate society more, and they destroyed it themselves from the within, exactly for this reason. And in two circumstances, at least, the church requested a general penitence for the participation to a public war. And this is very important because they are real events that took place not after a single individual or action, but for an entire war. For example, after the bloody Battle of Soissons that was fought on Sunday, June the 15th, 923, Sunday, actually, you shouldn't be using arms, right? That's the thing that would start developing after a time, but it was also seen in a military sense as the day of the Lord, and therefore something very powerful. Think about the Sunday of Bouvines that establishes properly the monarchy, and with all its ecclesiastical reality 300 years later in the same context here, because this was the battle in which the troops of Charles the Simple prevailed over the ones of the tyrant Robert, Count of Paris, right, and usurper of the royal crown that actually would, the descendants of which he died in battle actually, but at the end they won the war. As you know, the Robertians are nonetheless, but the Capetians, so from which all the other major sovereigns in Europe, from the Valois, the Bourbon, etc., stamped. And in Western Francia, and the Synod of Rheims imposed the penitence of the belligerents of both sides. This is fascinating. So you find a church that has a kind of this capacity of pacifying even the situation after the engagement, because after all there are certain situations in which that is necessary. In the 10th century, major baths of blood were something that could shift dramatically the balance of not just of politics in society, but literally of economical production, of demographics. Right, it was a big deal. So after these baths of blood, sometimes you had to come back together, because if you wanted to resist to external threats, right, at the same time, this is a nutshell the history of those times. Always fighting with everybody all the time, and aligning yourself with your former enemy and fighting your former ally, and so on. And here the text goes like this. It says, that of the penitents, that for 3 Lents during 3 years they shall make penitence, so that during the first they have to be excluded by the church and eventually remitted for the dinner of the Lord. And during these 3 Lents, in the 2nd, 4th, and 6th Sunday, they shall abstain from every food except bread, salt, and water. Otherwise, they have to pay a ransom. And similarly, in the 15 days before the Nativity of St. John Baptist and of the Savior, and every 6th Sunday for all the year, unless they do not ransom, or that a solemn festivity fell on that day, that is, they can't be, they may fall ill or have to just to serve in the army proper. So this is fascinating, because naturally you understand the articulation of this penitence that is pretty demanding for those times standards. After all, there is some important symbolism, but it still shows essentially a world that goes on fighting no matter what, right? That you can't even be under penitence, but you may have to be called in the army once again, and therefore we all know what this whole thing is about. And you see what's by the 10th century, what the vassalitic beneficiary reality in terms of the development of a military aristocracy had brought to. Right, that there is a public. This was public, right? And this must be carried out by those who have fought from both sides in the battle, right? And here I would like to add that the level of violence of those years was extreme, right? When you see this regulation, you think that this was a society that after all cared so much, but we have just seen actually that. These were formalities that the church was substantially trying to impose to a reality that was otherwise ravaged by violence. In the following centuries, it would be an attempt to regulate properly violence, right? The one waged either against the church or against other secular individuals. Consider that in Carolingian Italy there are some capitulars from Ludwig II, right? And at the time the Carolingians had a substantial control of their armed forces in the peninsula, and there is an express capitular that states for an expedition to I don't remember, it was against the Saracens in the south. Or against some rebels like the Longobards in the south that had remained in suspense in the frontier, that stated explicitly that while the Lent was approaching, the soldiers had to abstain from raping and from burning churches. That is to say, the reality of 9th century Carolingian Italy, the king was asking to his soldiers to refrain, at least before Lent, the time before Lent, to avoid raping and burning churches, as if before that was after all a fine thing. And the reason being here, you think this was normality all over that world, right? What do you think wars are fought like? Have you ever do you see wars are how they are fought? Every war has ever been fought. Open a history book. You think the churches were not destroyed, that women were not raped, that this depended which religion you were. This was a universally religious world. It was a universally Christian world by name. And this means that all the same violence that has ever been committed in every society is simply committed in here, because guess what? It's a human society. And these things are always being done. I repeat it, look at every single damned war that has ever been fought, and look at all the crimes against humanity that have been perpetrated there. That's not a 20th century invention. These things have always been done, and these people were no better than what we are today in this regard, and even for their own context, right? And don't think that people didn't care. As we were saying in the beginning, don't think that people said, well, okay, it's normal, and I do it. The reality is that I can, and I do it. And if there is no central authority that can impose firmly an authority, a stop to these bloodsheds, people will keep doing that, because that's what we have learned from the history of humanity. If you don't bring order, which incidentally is done with violence, you can't spare society from violence. This sounds like a paradox, but it's reality. Think about the power the state has today. It's being greater in any other time history has been. It doesn't matter if you live in countries of civil law or common law, your state is a freaking centralized monster that can wipe you out from a moment to another, right? The rest is fiction, right? It's not people with guns, random people with guns that will save us from a resistance against it. It doesn't work like that, right? It doesn't work like the guerrilla wins all the wars. Guerrilla has been devastated and annihilated a countless amount of time, right? That's a Western childish psychological trauma and a socialization to justify its own failures in certain realities, that we invented this thing that guerrilla warfare is enough to destroy someone. In order to keep someone out of your land, you have to have a freaking monstrous state that will kick ass to anybody who will try to step in, and that is done just by entrusting an enormous load of power in the hands of those who govern. And this is in the history of civilization in a nutshell. If you don't accept this, you're just living in a world of fantasy, right? And people found out the hard way, because now they are ashes, right? Those who try to go in arms against this reality. And that's the positive thing, because if we would allow everybody to decide whether to do things, there wouldn't be a society, it wouldn't be a civilization, it wouldn't be an order, it wouldn't be peace of any kind. And systems that do not hold because they are corrupted, because they are unjust, because they're unfair, crumble on their own. Because humans have the intelligence to understand when they are in phase of power, to realize what is that will work and what will not. And this is why we do give power to governments, because we know what are the circumstances that will bring them down, right? And that's why we hopefully, at least by this moment, we live in a free world that has the most destructive potential in the whole history of mankind. And we should be proud of that, because that is how much care we give to our own lives. That measures the cost of our lives. Because otherwise we would go around shooting at people in the streets, right? There is a lot we could discuss in this regard. But passing to the second example, in 1070, 4 years after the Battle of Hastings, a council of Norman bishops that was presided by Ermenfrid imposed a penitence to the soldiers of William the Conqueror, in spite of the fact that the invasion of England was renowningly carried out under the papal banner, right? And this was done against perjury in general, because the same expedition required a concrete belief, and also considering that, aside from the fact that the violences that followed in Anglo-Saxon England after the Norman conquest were dramatic, right? But aside from that, there was properly the necessity of finding out whether those who had killed, right, during the war of conquest had done it by repenting of their sins. And once again, I think this is an extremely deep and you see, if those societies didn't care, right, if that was the monstrous, primitive, dark, obscurantistic world we would think, for whichever reason, we wouldn't have a spiritual community, a religious community like the church that says, it doesn't matter whether, we fought this war under Christian banners, we must be sure that our people are safe, right? That they repented and they can atone for their sins, so that our society can be better. And this is what you see. This is not different from what our world today reasons, and we're talking about the 11th century. And things began there. Most of what we associate in an Enlightenment perspective to, the achievements of human rights and equality, they were basically all expressed easily by Christianity, in part even by the pagan world. If you look at the Roman philosophy, other Hellenistic philosophies, other religions were there already, right? And this is the Middle Ages are actually, in the early Middle Ages, are the moment in which the next step was taken further to spread this, and especially to self-regulate on the basis of this very moral standards. And therefore, I think we should think twice when we say, that the rest of our history, what it's really been like, whether we lived up to these principles or we went astray in many ways, and surely did, right? Considering especially the history of the 20th century, like there is something there that goes beyond the mere struggle for power. There is something there that entails the abandonment of these standards, which is a whole different thing, right? Alright, as I was saying at the beginning, we'll keep talking about this stuff, and surely we will expand heavily, especially in connection with the rise of knighthood, right? The idea that there was a heavy disciplining of the political and military class under these religious ideals that was largely unfruitful in some ways. Like, for centuries, these elites kept reasoning exactly as those Carolingian knights thought after Fontenoy. As I was saying before, even those Byzantine soldiers, they didn't give a damn. And part of the reason why they didn't give a damn, there wasn't a state to enforce that, right? And that's the reason why we didn't have modern, permanent professional armies that were intensely drilled to perform highly sophisticated maneuvers. This is for the same exact reason. And it is not to say that medieval warfare of political and social systems were unrefined, were very sophisticated. But they were very sophisticated for their own context, right? And that's what truly matters, and that's what has a lot to do, naturally, even with our necessity of criticizing or judging this reality, because we may be actually not so fit for doing that. We may discover actually that these people cared for problems that are actually very important, that today we don't give a damn anymore, and that this could be an enormous problem, especially in terms of the fact that societies do not always have to go better automatically, and therefore losing track of these ideals is or even ideas, because I suspect that people simply do not even hear anymore of this stuff. They're not educated about this, and part of the reason is, of course, nobody studies these topics, and everybody's rather obsessed with large beefy warriors to smash things in a kind of fantasy video games, and that's the intellectual standards to which we have atrophied. But aside from that, these are my usual rants, and I just we stop it here. I don't add anything else. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you again next time.